November 22, 1963, should have ended Lyndon Johnson's career. Bribery testimony in the Senate, a Life magazine expose ready to destroy him. Then, inside a cramped Air Force One, with Kennedy's body steps away, Johnson is sworn in, turns and smiles as Albert Thomas, his most powerful ally, winks. The original negative disappears, investigations vanish overnight, and the world is left asking, why did the new president smile at that moment, and what did it mean for America? Houston's Rice Hotel shimmered with power on the night of November 21, 1963. The ballroom filled with over 1,000 guests, politicians, oil men, defense contractors, and their spouses, all gathered for the Albert Thomas Appreciation Dinner. The guest of honor, President John F. Kennedy, took his seat at the head table, flanked by Vice President Lyndon Johnson and Congressman Albert Thomas himself. Around them, Texas's inner circle mingled. George and Herman Brown of Brown and Root, Speaker Sam Rayburn, Jesse Jones of the Houston Chronicle, and a constellation of Suite 8F regulars. The air buzzed with the kind of influence that never needed to be named. That night, Kennedy's presence was not just ceremonial. He was the outsider in a room built on decades of Texas alliances. Albert Thomas, as chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, controlled the flow of billions in federal contracts. His reach extended from NASA projects to military bases, and his friends in the Suite 8F group made sure the money circled back to Houston. The Lamar Hotel, just blocks away, kept Suite 8F ready at all hours for these men to draw the lines of power. Texas Monthly would later call this web of relationships unequaled in state and national government. At the podium, Thomas beamed as he introduced Kennedy, but the real drama played out in the glances exchanged at the tables. Johnson, ever watchful, sat between his president and his oldest Texas ally. For years, Johnson had depended on Thomas's purse strings and the Suite 8F network to climb the ranks. Brown and Root's fortunes had risen with Johnson's, their campaign money flowing into his elections, their contracts swelling with every new defense bill. The dinner was a celebration, but also a reminder. In Texas, political survival was a group project. As the speeches ended and the orchestra struck up, the city's elite drifted toward their private or after parties. Kennedy left for his hotel, unaware that this gathering would be his last in Houston, or that the men surrounding him had spent decades mastering the art of backroom deals. The next morning, these same faces would be in Dallas, and by afternoon, the world would look to them for answers. But for one more night, the Suite 8F crowd toasted their own, confident that in Texas, nothing happened without their blessing. Federal money didn't just flow through Texas, it pooled in the right pockets. Albert Thomas, as chair of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, sat at the crossroads of every major spending bill for military, bases, aerospace, and infrastructure. The Brown brothers, George and Herman, had built Brown and Root from a small road contractor into a powerhouse by knowing where those rivers of cash would run next. Their partnership with Johnson stretched back to his earliest campaigns, but the real payoff came when Thomas and Johnson steered the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center to Houston in 1961. The records show George Brown donated the land for the site, and Brown and Root landed the construction contract, an arrangement that turned a government project into a windfall for Suite 8F's inner circle. Numbers tell the story better than any rumor. Billions in defense contracts passed through Thomas's subcommittee, and Houston's new NASA center became the pride of Texas and the anchor for decades of federal investment. But the pipeline didn't close after Kennedy's visit. In the months following Johnson's swearing in, Brown and Root secured a $380 million Navy contract to build bases and facilities tied to the Vietnam buildup. That deal, logged in Navy procurement ledgers, dwarfed anything the company had seen before. The Austin Chronicle would later call the relationship between Johnson and Brown and Root totally corrupt but mutually beneficial. Every contract, every earmark, deepened the bond between Johnson, Thomas, and the Brown brothers. The Suite 8F group turned its political muscle into concrete rewards, literally reshaping Houston's skyline in the balance sheets of their companies. For Johnson, the alliance meant more than campaign funds. It was the engine behind his rise from rural Texas to the White House. For Brown and Root, it meant government checks arriving like clockwork, no matter who sat in the Oval Office. The pattern was clear. When Thomas and Johnson worked together, the money never stopped coming home to Texas. Bobby Baker's fall from grace wasn't just a headline, it was a political earthquake. On October 7, 1963, Baker resigned from his post as Secretary to the Senate Majority after a string of investigations exposed a lifestyle that didn't add up. His official salary hovered under $20,000 a year, but reporters uncovered evidence of more than $2 million in assets, luxury homes, cars, and investments. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Baker's connections stretched from Capitol Hill to Las Vegas casinos, with rumors swirling about mob ties and payoffs to politicians. By November, Baker's scandal dominated the front pages. Life magazine ran a cover story on November 8th, splashing Baker's face across newsstands nationwide. The article pulled no punches, outlining his role as a fixer who greased the wheels of power for Lyndon Johnson and his Texas allies. The Serve You Corporation, a vending machine business Baker set up, became a symbol of backroom deals, its contracts landing in government buildings with suspicious speed. Senate hearings dug into how Serve You's profits filtered back to campaign coffers and personal accounts. Baker's resignation set off a chain reaction. Reporters and Senate investigators traced his network of favors and kickbacks, each thread leading closer to Johnson's office. Rumors of suitcases stuffed with cash, Magnavox stereos delivered as gifts, and advertising contracts for Johnson's TV station began to surface. The press called it the biggest scandal to hit the Senate in a generation. As Baker's empire crumbled, the stakes for Johnson grew by the day. His closest aide was under fire, and the media was circling. The next witness on the Senate's list, Don Reynolds, was preparing to testify about direct kickbacks to Johnson himself. For Johnson, the Baker scandal wasn't just political trouble, it was a threat to everything he'd built in Washington. Don Reynolds walked into the Senate Rules Committee room on the morning of November 22, 1963, carrying documents that could end a political career. Reynolds was no Washington insider, just an insurance agent from Maryland. But his paperwork told a story in numbers and signatures. Senators listened as Reynolds described a Magnavox stereo, retailing at $585, purchased in his name, but delivered to Lyndon Johnson's residence. He produced the invoice, stamped and dated, and explained how he had been pressured to buy $1,200 in advertising on Johnson's Austin television station, money that never made business sense, except as a favor. Reynolds' testimony didn't stop at stereos and ad buys. He described seeing a suitcase stuffed with $100,000 in cash, recounting Bobby Baker's claim that it was a payoff to Johnson for steering the TFX fighter contract. The committee pressed for details, and Reynolds handed over checks, receipts, and letters. Evidence that tied Johnson to a web of kickbacks and favors. The questions grew sharper. Senators asked about Johnson's role in awarding government contracts, about who benefited when the money flowed through Washington and back to Texas. Outside the hearing room, reporters waited for the next shoe to drop. The Baker scandal had already toppled one of Johnson's closest aides. Now, with Reynolds' testimony, the legal net appeared to be tightening around the vice president himself. The numbers were specific, the paper trail clear. If the allegations stuck, Johnson faced more than embarrassment. He faced possible indictment. Then, as Reynolds was still answering questions, the news broke. President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. The hearing dissolved into chaos. Senators left their seats, staffers scrambled for telephones, and the threat to Johnson's future vanished in the confusion. The committee would never return to Reynolds' evidence with the same urgency. For a brief moment that morning, the danger was real and measured in dollars and signatures. By afternoon, the focus of the nation had shifted forever. Inside the offices of Life magazine, the presses had been set for a story that would have changed the course of American politics. James Wagenvord, then a senior editor, watched as months of work prepared for the issue scheduled to hit newsstands the week of November 24, 1963. The subject was Lyndon Johnson, a detailed exposé built on leads from Bobby Kennedy in the Justice Department, linking Johnson to the scandals that had already toppled Bobby Baker and forced Navy Secretary Fred Korth to resign. Wagenvord later recalled, on publication, Johnson would have been finished and off the 1964 ticket, probably facing prison time. But as news of Kennedy's assassination swept through the newsroom, the entire operation changed in an instant. Wagenvord's boss collected every draft, every research file, every numbered copy of the nearly print-ready exposé. Without a word from outside, the top editors shredded the materials, erasing months of investigation in a matter of minutes. No external pressure was recorded, no official order relayed, just a silent decision made at the highest level of editorial control. Instead of Johnson's downfall, the magazine pivoted. The next issue focused on the Zapruder film and the chaos in Dallas, its pages filled with images of grief and confusion. The original exposé vanished, leaving only a few private recollections and rumors among the staff. For those in the know, the timing was unmistakable. The investigation into Johnson's finances and political ties, so carefully built, ended on the same day he took the oath aboard Air Force One. Wagenvord's memory of the shredding remains one of the few surviving traces of a story that nearly saw daylight, only to be buried as quickly as Kennedy's casket was loaded onto the plane. The stateroom on Air Force One was thick with heat and tension, every inch crowded with faces straining to witness history. Lyndon Johnson stood at the center, his right hand raised, Judge Sarah Hughes reciting the oath. Jacqueline Kennedy, her pink suit still stained with her husband's blood, stood silent and unmoving at his side. The press pool, jammed into the cramped quarters, watched for any sign of emotion. Sid Davis, reporting for Westinghouse, later described Johnson as unshakable. I never saw anybody more resolved. He had his wits totally about him. Johnson himself whispered to his secretary, "I've lived a year since this morning." Lady Bird Johnson, recording the moment in her diary, noticed the rawness of Jackie's presence. One leg almost entirely covered with blood, right glove caked with blood, she wrote. Johnson insisted Jackie stand beside him for the ceremony, and she agreed, refusing to change her clothes. When the oath ended, Johnson turned first to Lady Bird, kissing her gently. Then he kissed Jackie, who did not react, and took Evelyn Lincoln's hand, offering words of condolence. Reporters noted that Johnson brushed off any attempt at congratulations, keeping his focus on the gravity of the moment. General Godfrey McHugh, Kennedy's military aide, watched from the edge of the room. In later years, he called Johnson's conduct the worst performance he'd ever witnessed, a judgment shaped by grief and the shock of the day. But in that stateroom, Johnson's demeanor was calm, almost clinical. He moved from person to person, his face set, his voice steady. The press pool scribbled notes, capturing every detail. The sequence was deliberate: oath, kisses, condolences, then a turn toward the Texas Congressman, Albert Thomas. In that instant, the camera caught a smile that would fuel questions for decades. The photograph, preserved in archives and memory, leaves no easy answers, only the uneasy contrast of composure, ritual, and the silent anguish of those crowded into the heat and noise of Air Force One. Some images disappear quietly, leaving behind only questions. In the archives of the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library, the catalog tells a story in what's missing. The official photographic record of Johnson's swearing in is incomplete. The original negative of the so-called wink photograph, Johnson turning toward Albert Thomas, a smile flickering as Thomas's eye closes in a wink, never made it into the public collections. Historian Richard Trask, who spent years combing through assassination-era materials, flagged the omission. The library's own catalog tagged the image as an inappropriate gesture, a label that set it apart from the rest. High-quality prints and copies circulate among researchers, but the negative itself is absent from the official holdings. Cecil Stoughton, the White House photographer who took the picture, would later reflect on that moment. He said the gesture could be innocent or sinister, and over time he leaned toward the latter. For Stoughton, the exchange between Johnson and Thomas stood out from the chaos and grief that filled the stateroom. It was a split second, captured forever, but the meaning behind it remains unsettled. No formal explanation has ever been given for the missing negative. The Johnson Library has released thousands of photographs from that day, but this one image, cataloged and then quietly withheld, remains an exception. The official record is silent on why it vanished or who made the decision to remove it. What's left is a gap, a missing piece that invites speculation. Was it simply a matter of taste, a desire to spare the new president embarrassment? Or was there something in that smile, in that wink, that someone wanted to keep from the public eye? Cecil Stoughton took thousands of photographs in his career. Only one, he said, left him wondering which story it really told. The negative is gone, but the questions remain. Was the gesture in that crowded cabin just a fleeting moment between old friends, or something the world was never meant to see? Power brokers still shape events from behind closed doors, leaving the public to read meaning into missing evidence in silent gestures. As archives remain sealed and key negatives vanish, the line between coincidence and intent grows thinner. What's hidden shapes what we believe. In a world built on images, the story behind a single smile can still change history. What does that say about the stories we accept today?